but I want to look at the Jewish, I, I won't say the Jewish view, a Jewish view or Jewish views of capital punishment, particularly in American society. And I have to say that I mean, it's something that I've been interested in a long time, and I'll lay all my cards on the table. And some of you have heard me speak about this in sermons or whatever. I am an abolitionist when it comes to capital punishment. Um, I lived in Connecticut when capital punishment was abolished in that state. I then moved to Maryland, and capital punishment was eliminated in Maryland shortly after I moved here. Now, correlation does not prove causation, but I'm going to claim credit anyway for those two things. Um, but to some extent, my interest in teaching this subject began during the run up to the confirmation hearings for Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Because when she was in law school, she published a law review article where she essentially said that religious Catholic judges who belong to a church which is opposed to capital punishment, and the Catholic Church is opposed to capital punishment, that religious judges should recuse themselves from capital cases rather than sentence somebody to death. And she was roundly slammed for this article. Oh, you're putting your religion before. I have to say, and this is something that you may not hear me say very often, I 100% agree with her. And I 100% agree with that article. I mean, I think if if there is a conflict between your religious commitments and the civil law, the proper thing to do is recuse. Now, at a certain point, you may get to the point where you simply can't do your job and also be faithful to your religion, in which case I think you need to resign. I mean, and I do not remember this because I was a toddler at the time, literally an infant. But when John F. Kennedy ran for the presidency in 1960, as the first Catholic president, and he was asked what would he do if there was ever a situation where he could not fulfill his obligations as president and also be faithful to his Catholic religion. And he said that he would resign the presidency. So this got me really to thinking about the question of capital punishment and our role in the system. Now, I have to say, obviously, I mean, you read your way through the Torah, and there are many dozens of offenses for which the Torah proclaims capital punishment. All right. Including, being a smartass to your parents if you're a teen, including gathering sticks on Shabbat, all kinds of things, and yet, we do not enforce these at all. I mean, obviously one of the reasons is that we don't have the authority to do so, right? I mean, Jewish courts in this country have the authority that Jews are willing to give them, and Jewish courts still do function, obviously. I mean, if you've ever been involved in a conversion, you appeared before a Jewish court. If you ever were involved in a religious divorce, you appeared before a Jewish court. But we have authority in civil matters to the extent that people choose to follow that authority, but we don't have any authority in criminal matters. So, aside from the fact that if I could sentence congregants to death for not observing the Sabbath, um, our congregation would be even smaller than it is. But beyond that, I don't have the authority, and it would be interesting to be hauled before a judge and charged with murder, and claim that you should be released on First Amendment grounds because freedom of religion. But in point of fact, there are a lot of procedural safeguards, even that the Torah institutes, let alone later um, rabbinic law. And the first of them is the requirement for 2 eyewitnesses, right? You cannot sentence somebody to death in biblical law unless there are 2 eyewitnesses. And so immediately, many of the convictions that we have in the American penal system would not stand under Jewish law because they lack 2 eyewitnesses. And then, of course, later on, the rabbinic enactments, what's known as hatra'ah, which means that the witnesses have to not only observe the act, but have to warn the person beforehand that if they commit the act, they could incur capital punishment, and they have to acknowledge receiving the warning. It's kind of like an advance Miranda warning, so to speak. And to imagine that could ever happen, I think is a fantasy. I mean, I can't imagine, 2 witnesses. Hey, if you commit that murder, you'll be possibly sentenced to death, and the murderer says, "Yes, I acknowledge that. Nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead." I mean, it's pragmatically, I think it would be next to impossible to have a conviction that would stand under halakha. But I do want to look at some sources on this question. Okay, so the first one is Mishnah is from the Mishnah from Makot, chapter 1, Mishnah 10, and I'll screen share it. Okay, so this is sort of like the classic rabbinic text that's often quoted in discussion of capital punishment. A Sanhedrin that execute once in 7 years is called bloodthirsty. Okay, the Sanhedrin was the highest court, and death penalties actually was for capital cases. It was a minimum of 23 judges, and only the Sanhedrin could sentence somebody to death. So a Sanhedrin that executes once in 7 years is called bloodthirsty. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said even once in 70 years. Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Tarfon said, had we been in the Sanhedrin, none would ever have been put to death. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, then these sages would have created more murderers in Israel. Okay, so let me throw this question out. On the basis of this text, is Judaism pro or anti-capital punishment?
Pretty much.
Alan.
Yeah, I think they indicate that it can be done, and then there's a disparity between those who say you're bloodthirsty if you do it more than once in 7 years and more than once in 7 years, and then there's some who say we wouldn't do it at all. But the problem is it is there, it's done. It's just that I think it's the lesson that we have for today for our people too, that it should be used sparingly if it's ever used at all, I don't believe in it. And let me just say that up front. The judge I worked for didn't believe in it, but I believe that there are circumstances when Jews would countenance the death penalty.
Right. Anybody else want to chime in on this particular source? Anyone? All right. I mean, I think that the best answer would be, and of course, this is why I corrected myself from saying the Jewish view, because there are many Jewish views, right? But I think that clearly, going back to the Mishnah, there were sages who said it should be used sparingly, and sages who said it should be used never, and other sages who said, well, there's a consequentialist argument, right? That the death penalty serves as a deterrent. And if you get rid of the death penalty, you will actually have an increase in crime, right? I mean, the very same debate that we are having in American society in 2021 was by the sages of the Mishnah, 1800, more than 1800 years ago. So like I said, I mean, I think that there is an ambivalence towards the use of capital punishment, where it certainly remains a theoretical possibility, but one that should be used sparingly. Okay, so now we get to a more recent statement, and this is from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement. This is passed actually in 1960. And when I first read it, it's very different than the type of things that are coming out of the law committee, the CJALS now, because it's not even a responsum. It's simply a statement, more in the realm of a resolution. And it was authored by the rabbi who was the head of the law committee at the time, Rabbi Ben-Sion Boxer, who's well known. You may have used the Boxer prayer book when you were growing up, if you're older than I am. And this is what he said, and it was passed by the law committee. Again, their procedures were different, so we don't know exactly what was the vote. Only God has the right to take life. When the state allows itself to take life, it sets an example which the criminal distorts to his own ends. It proves to him that man may take into his own hands the disposition of another man's life. The elimination of capital punishment would help to establish a climate in which life will be held sacred. The sense of the sanctity of life needs to be bolstered in our time, and it will be perhaps the greatest contribution toward deterring crime and violence. The abolition of capital punishment will be an important step forward in the direction of a more humane justice. It will free America from a black spot of barbarism, which still disfigures the good name of our country. All right, so there's no ambivalence there at all, right? This conservative movement in 1960 was firmly opposed to capital punishment, and it offered, in fact, the reverse of Shimon ben Gamliel's argument, right? Shimon ben Gamliel said eliminating capital punishment will actually multiply murders. And Rabbi Boxer is saying, no, quite the opposite, that when the state seeks to solve problems by the use of violence, the lesson is that violence is an acceptable way of solving disputes, right? And that capital punishment, far from serving as a deterrence, actually capital punishment increases violence in society. Now, again, I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, correlation does not prove causation, right? But if you look at the murder rate in industrialized countries, right, the United States has far and away the highest murder rate of any industrialized country. We're also the last industrialized country to use capital punishment. Now, we're also the only, industrialized country where pretty much you can walk into a store and, buy, as I did, a very high-powered rifle. Now, I had to wait 3 days and then go back because I'd never bought a gun before. So when they did my background check, the FBI placed a hold because I wasn't already in their records. But it was relatively simple for me to buy, a very deadly weapon. And so that also, I think, clearly contributes to the murder rate. But it's again, it's a consequentialist argument that in 1960 placed the conservative movement firmly against capital punishment, and in 1999 the Rabbinical Assembly reiterated that position. Now I want to look at a text from Maimonides, okay? Because as I mentioned, according to halacha, you need 2 witnesses. The other thing is that circumstantial evidence is not admissible in halacha. Okay, and the example that Maimonides gives, I didn't bring that particular section of the quote, is that you see somebody run into a room with only one door. You see another person run in behind him with a knife. Some short time later, the second person exits with a bloody knife, and the first person is dead of knife wounds. Okay. I suspect, not being an attorney, but I suspect that, that particular set of circumstances would be likely to attain a conviction in most criminal courts. Okay. You cannot convict on that basis in a Jewish court. Okay, because there are no eyewitnesses. It's just purely circumstantial. And this is what Maimonides calls the realm of the possible, right? In other words, is it possible that this guy committed the murder? Certainly it's possible. Are we absolutely certain? We're not, right? There are other things that could explain it as well. Okay, so this is what Maimonides calls the realm of the possible, and it's a real. I find it, at any rate, a really interesting text. Okay, so this is from Sefer HaMitzvot, Negative Commandment 290. The realm of the possible is very broad. Had the Torah permitted deciding capital cases based even on a conjecture so likely that it seems absolutely certain, like the example we mentioned about the person chasing another with a sword, in the next case, we would decide based on a conjecture just a little less likely, and in the next, a conjecture less likely still, until we would sometimes execute people based on nothing more than the judge's imagination and opinion. Thus, the Exalted One shut this door and demanded that we not punish except when witnesses can testify without doubt or conjecture that they're absolutely certain the defendant did this deed. Inevitably, when we do not convict based even on very strong conjecture, we will sometimes acquit the guilty. While when we do convict by conjecture, sometimes we will execute the innocent. But it would be better to acquit 1,000 criminals than to kill a single innocent. Okay, any reactions, thoughts on that text? Yeah, Alan, once again.
You know, the standard that they're using is beyond the standard that we use in our criminal courts of beyond a reasonable doubt. When we say that, it's not beyond all doubt,
Right.
just beyond a reasonable doubt into a moral certainty. And certainly people could be convicted on uh, uh, circumstantial evidence. But the rationale that they use there, that if you start slipping a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, then you do away with due process essentially, because then it becomes, oh, I know they did it, or they did it before. And I think that's a very, very interesting passage, because it is a poll for beyond all doubt. I don't know that that's really realistic in our society for people to be punished, but I do think that that would be a good idea for a capital offense, and that's one of the strong reasons that capital punishment is wrong, because it is so arbitrary,
Right.
and that's a serious problem. And I'll tell you this very quickly. I once had a fellow talk to a fellow who was talking to a conservative lawyer that I know, and the conservative lawyer said he was in favor of the death penalty, and this other fellow had been a prosecutor in Prince George's County. And he said, you know, in Prince George's County, it's well known, we have a drug problem. It's well known that if you steal drugs from a drug dealer, the penalty is death. They're going to come after you and kill you. He
Right.
said, it happens every day. It's not a deterrent.
Right. No, it's definitely not. It's definitely not a deterrent. But so this is a classic sort of slippery slope argument, right? And and look, I mean, this is certainly a current argument in a very different sphere, right? I mean, if we look the other way, when 600 armed people invade the Capitol, right? What's the next thing that we're going to look the other way at, right? And what do you call a failed coup that's unpunished? A dress rehearsal, right? So that's really a problem. So that's a slippery slope argument. But Maimonides is very explicit. It is better to acquit 1,000 guilty people than to convict one innocent person, right? But that is a standard, maybe to strive for, but it's a standard that's not attainable, right? Now, just like Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who said, well, we would never allow executions, are not the only voice, then Shimon ben Gamliel comes in and says, yeah, and the result would be more murders. So Maimonides is also not the only voice. And a somewhat later authority known as the Ran, Rav Nisim Gerandi, Rabbi Nisim from Gerona, which is in Catalonia, and he lived in the 1300s, took a very different position. Well, let me just look at that text first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the content. Okay, so this is from Drashot Haran number 11. Some Torah laws do not address political order at all. These are addressed to matters more sublime than perfection of society. Maintaining political order is why we appoint a king. In contrast, the judges of the Sanhedrin were appointed to judge the people according to the true and intrinsically just law, which causes the divine to cleave to us regardless of whether the political order was perfected. In fact, some laws of the nations of the world actually produce a more effective political order than do the Torah's laws. But this is no shortcoming for us, for the king would correct any deficient political order. Okay, so the Ron is saying basically, yeah, these are ideals. And of course, ideals are ideal, but the real world isn't always that way. But when he says the king will correct any deficiencies, see, one of the problems that we face, and many of you have heard me address it before, right? And I mentioned on Wednesday in my email, Dina de Malchuta Dina, right? And I've taught enough about it that people are starting to say it back to me, ask me questions about it or quoting to me. But Dina de Malchuta Dina means that basically the government's law, it is a Jewish religious obligation to follow the government's law in most cases. All right, but the problem with Dina de Malchuta Dina is that it is, to quote, I forget his name, he's a professor at Bar Ilan, Gerald Blidstein. It is a term of alienation. In other words, there is the government and there is me, right? There is the government and there is the Jewish community, right? And the government is an entity that is different than me, and the government is an entity that is different than the Jewish community. It is a Gentile government, right? And so, you have these halachic sources that presuppose a kind of binary. Either it is a Gentile government or it's a halachic government, right? That is to say, a Jewish government. And the United States government is neither, right? It's not an entity that's outside of us, right? I mean, I have been a government official, right? I mean, I was chairman of a municipal ethics commission with governmental authority, right? Alan, your brother, exercises governmental authority, right? The chief of staff to the president of the United States is a Jew, right? The majority leader of the US Senate is a Jew. There are 9 or 10 Jewish senators. I forget which exactly, but we're either 9 or 10% of the Senate. We're less than 2% of the US population. There are roughly 30 Jewish members of the House of Representatives. Okay, again, way out of proportion to our share of the population. We certainly have, the Secretary of State is a Jew, right? The stepchild of a well-known Holocaust survivor who's written books about the Holocaust, right? The Secretary of Treasury is a Jew. The Homeland Security Secretary designate is a Jew, right? I mean, you can't simply say the government is outside of us, right? And therefore, when the Ron says, look, our Torah laws are sublime and perfect, and like most sublime and perfect things, they don't work in the real world, but don't worry about it. The Goyish king will take care of it for us, right? But yes, we still have a Goyish king, right? But we have lots of deputy kings and princes and princelings who are, not only not merely people who happen to be Jews, right? But people who take their Jewishness quite seriously, right? And so the government is not an entity that is external to us, right? I mean, even simply as a citizen who votes, we have a say in governmental policy if for no other reason. I mean, again, right? Who is the lead impeachment manager, right? A, a Jew who takes his Jewishness quite seriously. I mean, I met him when I was a first year Hillel director at AU, and he was a first year law professor at AU, right? I mean, this is, I mean, he's not from, but he takes his Judaism quite seriously, right? So you can't, so therefore, I mean, I would say that the state of American Jews was never contemplated by halakha. I mean, the same would be true in other democratic societies with significant Jewish community, Canada or the UK, Australia, possibly France, but to a lesser extent, because the Jewish communities are not as large, and frankly, the Jewish vote isn't as weighty in those. But I think the analogy still stands. I mean, you can't say, if you're a citizen of the UK, you can't say, well, that the government, whatever the government does, has nothing to do with me. It's not so. It does have something to do with you, simply by virtue of you being a citizen and a voter. Okay, so here's what Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky wrote. So in 2013, the law committee passed a responsum on the participation of Jews in the machinery of the death penalty. It was written by Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, somebody I know, Rabbi Anshe Chesed in Manhattan. And it was passed 20-0 by the law committee. And so I want to read to you some of what Rabbi Kalmanovsky says. Okay. There is wisdom in Ron's approach, right? What I just read, with its frank admission that even in biblical times, halachic purism was unrealistic for governing. Political questions do not always have halachic answers, and we may be sorry when we try to extract such religious resolutions. Theocrats sometimes must defer to professional politicians and permit them to guide society through their own imperfect methods. In Ron's argument, we find a religious step toward a secularization of politics, a step all modern Jews should appreciate. To summarize, while halakha is strongly averse to capital punishment as a matter of values, it also regards violent punishment, including execution, as a necessary response to serious crimes. While one hopes this provision would be almost never used, this feature of the halachic record, endorsed by the Talmud as well as all major medieval authorities and the Shulchan Aruch, forestalls any unequivocal conclusion that Jewish law forbids capital punishment. Okay, so, and I think this is true. I mean, I think that you cannot claim with a straight face that Jewish law absolutely forbids capital punishment. Having said that, it also demands you know, all right, let me figure out how to say it. So you can't say that halakha forbids all capital punishment, but it demands a level of certainty and a level of fairness that is almost impossible to achieve, right? And this is where we run into the problem is that, you know, I mean, so to get back to the concept of Dina de Malchuta Dina, right? Um, One of the necessary assumptions of Dina de Malchuta Dina is that the laws are applied fairly and evenly across the board, right? And so, you know, it could be a bad law, but if it's a bad law applied fairly and evenly, then it's valid Jewishly. For example, you know, 90% income tax, right? I mean, we would all agree that a 90% income tax is terrible policy and bad law. However, if Congress were to pass and the president to sign a bill establishing a 90% income tax, we would be religiously obligated to comply with that law because it's fair and across the board. If they were to pass a law that says 90% income tax except for white Protestants who only pay 20%, we would not be obligated to follow that law, right? Because it was not applied fairly and evenly across the board, right? And you know, anybody who studies the criminal justice system. In fact, I have a woman I dated for a while who at the time was a capital punishment public defender. Um, when I organized my trip to Nogales, one of the rabbis on that trip had previously been an appellate attorney specializing in capital cases. And he was just elected to he's the first Jew ever elected to the state legislature in Montana. He was elected in November. Um, and anybody who has any exposure to the criminal justice system knows, um, if you're rich, you are not going to get executed. Um, if you are a white person who kills a person of color, you are almost certainly not going to get executed. If you are a person of color who kills a white person, your chances of being executed are far, far higher. Um, you know, the death penalty is simply not applied fairly and evenly, right? And so I would say that, you know, while the death penalty is theoretically permissible, and you cannot really say with a straight face that it is not ever theoretically permissible, I would also say that as it's applied in the United States, forgetting even the question of circumstantial evidence or two witnesses and so on and so forth, which are rules that, in all intellectual honesty, apply to Jewish courts. But the idea that the law has to be applied fairly and equally doesn't apply only to Jewish courts. And I think it is really safe to say that the death penalty, as it exists in the United States today, um, you know, is not fair or equitable. I mean, you know, we saw this in, you know, the previous administration's rush to conduct lots of executions quickly between November and January before the new administration came in. We see this in the fact that, you know, even actual innocence is not a sufficient grounds for appeal if, you know, your lawyer has blown certain deadlines. and this is the kind of thing that I think that nobody should be willing to participate in. So I want to deal with the question. So Rabbi Kalinowski. So the question is, can a Jewish judge sentence somebody to death? Can a Jewish prosecutor ask for the death penalty? And Rabbi Kalinowski writes that in terms of prosecutors, prosecutorial discretion is very broad. Now, I don't know how accurate his perceptions actually are, but he says that if you are a prosecutor, you can ask for capital punishment in a case where you are absolutely certain of the guilt, there's no doubt, where the judge is fair, et cetera, but that as a general rule, Jewish prosecutors should not ask for the death penalty. And similarly, where there is discretion, in other words, if the judge by law is required, to follow jury sentencing decisions, or, the law is a mandatory death penalty or something like that, then the judge can do his job and follow the law. But where there's discretion, the death penalty should be avoided. The question of jurors is actually, to me, a little bit tougher, right? Because superficially, I would want to say that you should not serve on a jury in a capital case, right? That you should not be involved in the mechanism of death. However, right, and Alan, you could speak to this a little bit, and Joe, as a recovering lawyer, might be able to speak to this a little bit too, is that if you're a defense attorney, right, you want somebody like me to sit on the jury, right? And if those of us who are generally opposed to capital punishment self-exclude from the jury pool, or are excluded by judges from the jury pool, my conscience may be clean, right? But the defendant is worse off, right? And so that is something that needs to be taken into account as well. Does anybody want to share some thoughts on that? Yeah, Alan.
Well, I do. Let me tell you, as I said, I worked for a very conservative judge, but he did not believe in the death penalty. And I believe that in this country, there are all kinds of problems with it. But we are Jews. And when Eichmann was tried in Israel, he was executed. I believe very strongly that it sets a terrible, it's a terrible standard when a person is killed by the state, as opposed to in war or in self-defense, but it's killed cold-bloodedly by the state. But we have the Eichmann situation. And what do you do when you have somebody that's that horrible, who's been found to be that horrible? And it's a conundrum, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, it might interest you to know that in the Eichmann case, both chief rabbis actually were against his execution, and Martin Buber, the great philosopher and theologian, was also against it. And his suggestion, which I actually I think has some merit, is that rather than execute him, he should have been forced to live out his life on a kibbutz so that he could see that he had failed, right? That the person who wanted to eliminate Jews from the earth, forced to observe every day happy, healthy, thriving Jewish kids growing up in the Jewish state. And I think there is some merit to that, because obviously, if your argument for the death penalty is deterrence, right? I mean, did the execution of Eichmann have any deterrent effect,
No.
right? I mean, there are things that I could hold to be theoretically wrong, but yet not lose a lot of sleep over, right? And I suspect, had I been an adult, I think he was executed in like 64, so I was 4 years old. But had I been 24 instead of 4 when Eichmann was educated, I suspect I wouldn't have lost a lot of sleep over it. um but when push comes to shove, I probably would have said, probably better not to do it. But interestingly, that is the only execution that the state of Israel ever carried out. Um, so the problem with jury service is that, um, you know, um, I mean, you don't just sort of randomly get on a jury, right? You're questioned by the judge and by the attorneys for both sides, and often you are asked, you know, are you opposed to capital punishment in all cases, right? Or could you ever see yourself voting to sentence somebody to death, or a question of that ilk? And therefore you can sort of self-disqualify yourself, right? But Rabbi Kalmanovsky says, you can, he says, to determine whether they can follow the law, prospective jurors are typically asked something like, would you always vote for life without the possibility of parole over the death penalty, regardless of the circumstances of the case? Even observant Jews who oppose the death penalty could answer that question in the negative, right? In other words, right, I could imagine theoretical set of circumstances under which I could vote for the death penalty, right? And the answer is I could, right? I mean, are you going to reach that level of certainty in this case? Well, I can't answer that. I haven't heard the case yet, right? I have to hear the evidence, right? But I would not say that I am inalterably opposed to capital punishment in all cases. Period. That's a true statement. I mean, I am inalterably opposed to the death penalty as it is carried out in this country now. But that's not the question I was asked, right? So, I mean, to me, I think my view about participation in a jury is a consequentialist one, right? I mean, if we think that the death penalty is problematic, right, then keeping our own hands clean at the risk of actually, I mean, come to think of it, it's similar to Shimon ben Gamliel's objection to what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon said, right? If I keep my hands clean and manage to get myself off the jury, I may feel better about myself, but I've actually, even in a fractional way, made the execution of that defendant more likely, not less likely, right? And that, I think, is the conundrum. Now, Kalmanovsky doesn't really address the question of, participation in the actual execution. he basically says, there aren't a lot of Jewish prison guards, and especially there aren't a lot of Jewish prison guards on death row. And if you are opposed to capital punishment, being a guard on death row is probably not a good job for you, and you should seek other employment. But to me, that is really a harder question. I think that he doesn't really deal with it, at least not adequately. But again, that's not he is correct that's not a question. I mean, all of us have the possibility of being called for jury duty. Although probably not in a capital case, right? But so but I have to say that reading Kalmanowski's response actually changed my mind. Because I, prior to reading that, would have said that you can't have anything to do with it. That you cannot prosecute a capital case. You cannot be a judge on a capital case. You cannot be a juror in a capital case. But he actually changed my mind, particularly about jurors, because for precisely the question of the consequences of those of us who are generally opposed to capital punishment, abstaining from jury duty in capital cases. So there you have it. Are there any questions or comments?
Rabbi, back to the prosecutor situation. If a prosecutor happens to be Jewish, didn't believe in the death penalty, he perhaps shouldn't hold the job. I mean, it's similar to remember the clerk in Kentucky who wouldn't issue the license for the gay marriages, right?
Right.
Actually did resign, in fact. So, I mean, the job of a prosecutor is to enforce the laws on the books.
Right. I mean, the question is, and I don't know the answer to this. I mean, judges can always recuse.
Right.
Right. Can a prosecutor recuse? I mean, I'm not aware that there exists a job such as, prosecutor whose sole job is to prosecute death penalty cases. Right. I mean, you could still be a prosecutor and just not take the death penalty cases.
Of course, even if you recuse yourself, it's still under the auspices of your office. So.
Well, of course it is, but I mean, how far are you going to carry it? I mean, if somebody, look, these 13 people who were executed in the federal prison system, were executed with my tax dollars.
Right.
Mhm.
I mean, the question is, how far do you push that argument, right? And I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I think you could conceivably be a prosecutor and still remain faithful to these ideals if you were given the ability to recuse. But it's a tough one. I mean, I mentioned this rabbi who was with me in Nogales, who was an attorney and is now a state legislator. Okay. And our last day down there, we spent a couple of hours in an Operation Streamline courtroom. Okay. Operation Streamline is essentially an accelerated process for quickly removing people from the United States who entered. It's actually not called entered illegally. It's called EWI, entering without inspection, right? Which is a misdemeanor unless you've already been deported, in which case it's a felony. Okay. And, it was an assembly line. And within 90 minutes, 75 people were deported. Okay. And then the judge came over to speak to us. And I have to say, before, and this is why learning is good, because, I went into the court prepared to hate the judge. And the judge was actually a very decent, very menschlich guy who attempted to make the process as humane as possible, addressed each defendant by name as, Mr. or Ms., Sir, addressed them by name, wished them good luck, made sure they understood what they were pleading to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he came over and spoke to us, and he refused, as expected, refused to answer questions about, what he thought. He said, look, we don't make the law. If you have problems with what you just saw, your address is Congress, it's not me. Anyway, it turns out that this judge and Rabbi Ed Staffman, who was a lawyer, have a close mutual friend. Okay, so Rabbi Staffman spoke, and he said, this judge hates it. He hates doing that rotation, but he has that rotation once every 6 weeks. And, he could either resign his position as a judge, or he could take that rotation and try to make it, as humane as possible under the circumstances. Right. And so, look, I mean, the question is, at what point do you reach a situation where you just can't live with yourself anymore? Right? I mean, and I don't know how to answer that, because it's a very individual answer. I mean, it's easy for me to sit in judgment of that judge, right? But I don't know that I would act differently if I were in his same shoes. I mean, it's just interesting. There's a we spoke about Eichmann. Okay, so during the Eichmann trial, Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was an American Jesuit priest, wrote a lot about spiritual. He was very influential in my spiritual development, but he was also a poet, and he wrote a poem called "Chant to be Used in Procession Around a Site with Furnaces." And it was a poem about the Holocaust, but it was a first-person poem about a Nazi concentration camp commandant who was hanged. All right, and the last few lines I can still quote from memory. He says, "You smile at my career, but you would do what I did if you knew yourselves and dared. Do not think yourselves better because you burn up friends and enemies with long distance missiles without ever seeing what you have done."
Mhm.
Right? And that's the thing. I mean, you can say, you can't be a prosecutor. You can say you can't be, but unless you're prepared to go to jail because you refuse to pay your taxes, because your taxes are used for, and there are people, right? There are people who have done that. I mean, it was not uncommon during the Vietnam War, for people to go to jail, or Henry Thoreau, who went to jail for refusing to pay his taxes because of slavery. I'm not willing to go that far. Maybe I should be, but I'm not, right? So am I less complicit? Like I say, I mean, the the drugs for the lethal injections were bought with my tax dollars. You know, I mean, if I was a Chabad rabbi, I'd say we should just all really daven so that Mashiach should come really quickly. But that's really the answer, right? Mashiach should come really quickly and we won't have these dilemmas, right? Until then, we have these dilemmas and you know, we can seek guidance from our tradition, but ultimately how far you're willing to push it, I think, is an individual question. Sue, you had your hand up.
Well, I mean, I was listening to what you said about Eichmann, and I can see the logic, you know, in, you know, having him live on a kibbutz. But, you know, where I get conflicted is what would be your solution to Manson and John Wayne Gacy and the Unabomber and Timothy McVeigh? Like, should they live their lives in prison? And of course, our taxpayer money is for that. And what happens if they are released after their fifth appeal and then they're out among us again? And that's where I run into a problem.
Right. I mean, look, I think the question with, you know, the first people that you mentioned, I think McVeigh is maybe a different story. Look, people like, you know, Manson and Gacy and so on and so forth, they may not reach the legal threshold for you know, insanity, and but they're nuts, right? And I don't think there is any such thing as deterrence for people who are nuts, right? McVeigh was perfectly sane, right? That's a different story. And I think McVeigh would be in the category of I'm theoretically opposed, but didn't lose a lot of sleep over it. You know, I mean, if you talk about living in prison the fact of the matter is that we appropriately have so many safeguards in place, right, that the death penalty is more expensive than life imprisonment. Right, because of the cost of appeals and so on and so forth. And also because there's such a long time generally between when the crime is committed and when the execution is carried out, that it's lost all deterrent effect anyway, right? So, you know, but McVeigh would be the type of person where you could say that, yeah, the halachic requirements were actually met, right? I mean, this was frankly, you know, I mean, race wasn't a factor, right? And there was no doubt about his guilt. So, you know, he's possibly the exception that proves the rule, right? In my case, I would say, you know, I mean, there are different halachic concepts like halacha ve'ein morin kain or shev al taseh. Halacha ve'ein morin kain means this is the law, but we don't teach it, right? Or shev al taseh, just sit and do nothing. Right. And so for McVeigh, like I said, you know, if you had asked me theoretically, do you think he should have been executed? My answer would have been probably not, but I'm not losing a lot of sleep over it. You know, but I think that is really the exception to the rule. Yeah. All right. Arlene, and then Marcia.
I sort of was thinking along the same lines as Sue, but the other thing which makes me kind of, you know, ambivalent about the whole thing is that if you think of, you know, a horrific crime personally affecting you, such as the death of a child or, you know, and that person, you know, has life imprisonment, and but every day you wake up and there are those people who can forgive, and I admire them, and they have a lot of religious belief, and they say, you know, I don't want the death penalty for this person, or they live with it because, you know, they feel it was God's way, or they're more forgiving than I would be. But I would have a hard time getting up every morning and thinking that person was still alive. And, you know, I don't know. I just would want it to go away.
Right. And I, I absolutely, believe in the aphorism, don't judge another person unless you have, spent some time in their shoes. Right. And that's why, I have a hard and fast rule that I do not judge Holocaust survivors, period. Whatever they say or do, I don't judge them. My only response to that would be is that I think one of the you didn't use this term, but one of the greatest myths of American society is closure. Okay. And I can tell you, as a rabbi who deals with death and dying, there is no such thing as closure. And, if you read the works of Sister Helen Prejean, right, Dead Man Walking, and she works with both people on death row as well as their victims. And one of the cruelest aspects of capital punishment is families who say, once the person who killed my daughter is executed, I will have closure. And then the person is executed and there's still no closure. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's when they become death penalty opponents. Mm-hmm. Right. Because they were sold a bill of goods. Right. This execution will take place and then you'll have closure. There is no such thing as closure. Period. Never. There's more and there's less. And, most of us have, or all of us have lost loved ones, and the pain is less intense with time, but there's never complete closure. There's never complete closure. So that is absolutely a myth. Marcia and then Barnaby.
Okay. One thing that's turned me off really of the death penalty is you talk about there isn't closure, but the instances where there's been inadequate defense, and how many times, particularly these are generally racially affects the Black population,
sure.
Of the miscarriage of justice. Innocent, but so determined to make a case, and then the ones that have turned up years later through some of the law students and some lawyers who have gone in to look at these cases again and discover there's a miscarriage of justice.
Right.
And to me, this gets back to you don't want to take one miscarriage of justice doesn't. I have problems with that, and that's really. It's maybe not a halakha getting it out right issue, but it's something that has always bothered me. You can't, a miscarriage of justice, someone's executed, you can't bring them back.
Right. No, it is a halakhic issue, because I think that the halakhic standard for execution requires absolute certainty. Mm. Right. And the Innocence Project has freed, more than 100 people from death row on the basis of and by the way, the Innocence Project is based at Yeshiva University Law School, right? Which is something to be really, really proud of, right? But and that's why, like when George Ryan was governor of Illinois, right? He didn't he said a moratorium, right? Because there are so many people on death row who may well be innocent, and I'm just putting in a moratorium until we can fix the situation and make sure that the people that we execute are actually guilty, right? I don't think that that's an unreasonable standard, that people who are executed, we should be certain that they're actually guilty, right? And this is a real problem. Yeah, Barnaby.
Yes, so I'd like to just talk about something from way back in the motherland. So the ROC on Taiwan still has the death penalty, still has capital punishment, and it was a big tool by the dictatorship back in the martial law days, and is lingered still to this day. Back in back when there's a dictatorship, people were given kangaroo trials and executed on the basis that they were supposedly spies. So the fact that the death penalty has lingered beyond that right now only serves to feed this sense of, I don't want to call it justice. It really is like a bloodthirsty mob, because the example I wanted to get to was it's a very prominent example. A few years back, someone murdered, beheaded a 4-year-old child in broad daylight in front of her parents, in front of the entire street. And basically the internet, the Taiwanese internet, the whole country basically called for his head to be cut off. And it was like almost everyone was for the death penalty except the child's mother, who actually ran for a city councilor on an anti-death penalty platform. And it just tells me that, for the people involved, you really can't get a sense of closure, like the rabbi said, but for society at large, one of the reasons that I think one of the reasons that certain places still keep the death penalty around is that people get a sense of mob justice. They want it served, and so it serves. It is another kind of political tool to placate the masses, so to speak. People want his head off because he committed a heinous crime. That shall be it.
Right. I mean, that's kind of, going in with Rabbi Boxer's opinion from 1960, that capital punishment, far from decreasing, actually increases violence, because when you feed into that mob vengeance, im ha'ochel ba ha'te'avon, right? The appetite comes along with the food. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good example. All right. Anybody else? All right. Thanks for sticking around. I love this class. We have some really great discussions, and it's nice, that we can all be honest and share our ambivalences and questions with each other. So thank you very much.
And Rabbi,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Lila Tov.
Thank you. Lila Tov.